Hi, I'm Debbie. I'm from the Sterling Heights Public Library. I'm going to be doing a little talk here about genealogy tips. Usually I do these one-on-one sessions at the library that people sign up for, but since we can't do that right now, I'm going to be doing this from my house. The first time I've ever done anything like this, so bear with me. Okay, the thing I'm going to be talking about is a website that you can get to for free from home called Michiganology.org. See that? It's Michiganology.org. If when you type it in, you forget and put .com instead of .org, you get a companion site that goes with this. The companion site is a retail store for Michigan-inspired items. I mean, it might be fun to look through, but you're not going to find these documents in that website. But the .org site will have the one thing that I'm going to be focusing on here is Michigan death certificates. And when you're doing genealogy, you really need to document all your information. So if you're putting in your family tree that, somebody died, was born, got married, you really ought to have backup documents for that. And you can usually find those online in different sources. But if you're looking for anybody in your family that died in Michigan between like 1895 to 1944, this is really the place to go. It's really a valuable resource. They have images, scanned images from the collection of the Library of Michigan and the Archives of Michigan, where they have all of these documents on microfilm, and they went through and put them online so that you can view them and print them and save them. They're not like official certified versions of the documents, so that if you need one for a legal reason, you would need to go to either through the state or the county that is holding the document to get a certified one with a seal and all that. So when you're searching for the documents, I mean, they have 10 million records online right now, and then as time goes by they add more images because there's a law, privacy kind of law, that requires documents to be at least 75 years old before they can be put online. So they're up to 1944 in the actual having the images online where you can see them, the actual certificate. After that, there's a few years that they have indexing where you can search a name and it'll come up and it'll say, this is the information, and it has most of the fields that are on the document filled out on the screen, just listed, this is the name of the person, this is where they live, this was their parents' names, things like that. But it's not the actual document as the microfilm has it. There is an advantage to seeing the actual document because it has more information, for one thing. And when you find it in these indexed, translated, transcribed versions of it, somebody had to look at that document and figure out what it was saying. And most of the documents were done in cursive handwriting. And even up into the 40s, you'll find most of them are like that. They're filled out in cursive. So, if somebody couldn't read somebody's handwriting, it could have gotten indexed under the wrong spelling of a name. So it's good to be able to look at the actual document because you yourself, if they're in your own family, you might recognize names and things better than somebody who didn't know you did when they were indexing this document. So you search for these things. They have, you search by the person's name if you want to. That would be the first thing to try. Sometimes that doesn't work, it doesn't come up, either because of spelling differences, and this search engine requires things to be spelled how they have it. Some genealogy databases, they'll give you varieties of spellings and the versions of names. This doesn't do that. It only searches the way you type it in. So you may have to try a few different things, versions of their names, or skip certain things. Like if you think the person, even if you think the person died in Michigan because, your great-grandparent lived in Michigan, sometimes they didn't die here. Sometimes they were traveling when they died, or they became sick or disabled and went to live with relatives in another state, so that when they died in that state, their death record would be in that state. You wouldn't find it in this. Some other states are starting to have databases like this that you can search, and they have the images too. Michigan was one of the first ones that did this, which was really cool for Michigan research. They've done a really nice job with that. So that's one thing. The Michiganology website is also going to be adding naturalization records to their database in the coming years also, which will be really useful too. They're not really in there and ready to go yet. So just a little history of reporting of vital record information. 1867 was when the state started requiring local governments to submit the documentation of deaths to the state. Before that, the counties that it occurred in, or a township or something, may have the records, but they weren't required to do anything with them beyond keep them in their own offices. So when you're searching things, if it's 1867 or after, you'll have a pretty good chance of finding it somewhere. Michiganology doesn't go back that far on their documents, but it's still good to know. So when you look at a document, it'll list the person's name who died. It'll list where they lived, like a street address, which is really helpful when you're doing genealogy. If you want to look in city directories or something like that, it's good to have the street address. Or if you want to look and see what their house looked like or something. It also may not have been their own house where they died. Like they could have been at a relative's or something. I had one in my own family like that I was looking at today, where I looked up one of my great-grandparents, and it had an address I didn't recognize. But then when I looked at who the informant was, who the person was who submitted the information to the government about their death, it was one of her daughters, and I think that was the house where her daughter lived in Detroit, and that's where that address came from. So if they died at a hospital, it would list the hospital. Back in this time period, 1944 and earlier, it was most often at houses, their homes that they died. So it shows where they lived, shows when they were born, and all this information is as was reported by the person they call the informant, which is listed on the form usually. So it lists their birthday, and then it computes how old they were. Like say they were 72 years and 3 months and 5 days, or it'll say that kind of thing. It'll say if they were married or not, if they were widowed, if they were married with a living spouse. It'll say what the spouse's name was. There's a spot for their parent, the person's parent, even if they're an adult, who their father was and where their father was born, and who their mother was, and their mother's maiden name, which is really important, and where their mother was born. Now, oftentimes that will not be filled out because the informant didn't know that information. Even sometimes their own family members may not have been aware of that kind of family history, or I suppose they're asked these questions at stressful times, when after this person has died, and maybe they're not really remembering really good. Sometimes if the person died and they were alone, sometimes I've seen like neighbors and that's names listed as the informant. So that information you might want to look at with a grain of salt sometimes, because they probably didn't know everything about that person's life. So it lists that, lists their date of death, of course. It lists some information usually about what was happening to them in their last couple days. If they were sick, it has the doctors, whatever doctor was dealing with them, how long they were seeing them for that situation, like if it was a couple days or months or hours or whatever. It lists their cause of death, which is really handy to know for your family medical history. It will usually be listed as a medical term, so you have to kind of be familiar with medical terms. And then the farther back in history you go, they call diseases and conditions kind of weird things sometimes, and you might have to Google something to figure out what they're talking about. And again, it's in cursive handwriting, so you have to really try to figure it out. Some of these documents will have a number written by the cause of death, like 125 or something like that. And there's codes for causes of death from the ICD, the International Code of or Classification of Diseases. And those have been around since the late 1800s, this classification scheme, but it was updated every so often. So you can find these online, what those codes mean, which are really helpful if, there's some kind of a scribble that you can't figure out and it's a scientific word anyway, and it's like, what is this? You can look it up. There's a website called wolfbane.com, WOLFBANE.com, and it has the years, the different editions of this code, and that, say your person died in 1926 and the last update was 1920, you can look at the 1920 codes, put in that number, and it'll tell you what it meant. And then usually looking at the handwritten version of that will make more sense. So there's that. Also, it will usually list where they're buried, which is another very useful thing. Cemetery and the city. I had a situation in my own family where there was a whole branch of my family I didn't know where they were buried. I assumed they were in Detroit, but I didn't know for sure. And I was searching in Michiganology and putting in last names and wasn't getting what I needed. And I found a death certificate for a stillborn baby. And they do have those in there. Usually it's just listed as a stillborn and then a last name. Sometimes it'll say baby and last name. Occasionally they're named, but I don't know, probably depended on the family, how they wanted to do that. But anyway, I found this record for a stillborn baby, which I didn't know had even existed. And it said what cemetery they were buried in, which turned out to be Forest Lawn in Detroit. And so I went to Forest Lawn and looked, and this whole branch of the family was not documented yet on Find a Grave or anything. So knowing this fact really made a difference. And we went to Forest Lawn and found that this whole branch of the family that I had been looking for was there. And so, my great-great-grandfather and all those people were just all right there in one spot. And I found that by finding this death certificate for this stillborn baby. So that's, it's really useful for a lot of things. You can pick out lots of facts on there from those forms. Let's see. So when you find a record that pertains to an ancestor, you usually will want to print it out at least, or there are ways to attach it electronically to, like if you have an online family tree, you can do that, and that's recommended to do. So yeah, you always want to document your vital events, marriages, births, and deaths. As far as where people are buried, the counties, you might think, well, yeah, I know my great-grandpa lived in, Oakland County, and when I'm searching, I'm only going to look in Oakland County, and if I see another John Smith that's in another county, I'm going to ignore that one because I know he lived in Oakland County. Well, they could have moved. They could have went to a hospital that was in another county. I mean, think in the Detroit area how often we cross borders, county borders, to go for medical care or whatever. And that happened then too. People were on business trips. People, were at their cottage when they died. Different things could happen. And so when you're looking through these names of lists, which I'm going to show you how some things look on the screen coming up, Don't discount ones that are listed in other counties because they could be the person you're looking for. So, okay, we'll look at that in a moment. This is a screen of Michiganology.org. So, they have quite a few different things here. They have the vital records, the naturalization records, which they're working on, and some other odds and ends that you might want to look through sometime if you're interested in Michigan history. But we want to look at vital records, which when you hear vital records, that means life event sorts of things, birth, marriage, death, usually. So vital records. This is the homepage for vital records. They're giving us an example of Harry Houdini's death certificate. He died in Detroit in 1926. And this is a little slice of the top of it. But he was a celebrity that showed up. So you can browse the death certificate collection, which means you can just look at, it has sections where you can click on a year and then it breaks it down by county. So if you wanted to browse everybody who died in 1932 in Ingham County, if you were so desperate that you wanted to do that because you couldn't find your person that any other way, you could browse and look at the names. That's where you would go in to do that. If you wanted to do a regular search, let's see, go in, advanced search here. Okay, so here we are in advanced search for death records. These are different fields that you can fill in if you want to. I wouldn't advise putting too many in because it might knock things out. And so I was going to show an example of my great-great-grandfather, Gustav Zimmerman. So I had it typed in before. Zimmerman. So here's Gustav Zimmerman, last name, first name, search. So these are all in Michigan because that's what the database is, so you don't need to worry about that. So how these hits display is you get your last names that you put in, your first names, and then the place is the county. So there's 3 Wayne County Gustav Zimmermans and 1 in Berrien County. So you would be looking at each of these to see if any, like I know that mine, or I'm assuming that it would have been in Wayne County because he lived in Detroit from what my research showed. And so there's 3 of those. So, you could look at different ones. This last one here, this one is kind of interesting. You can blow these up either with the dial on your mouse, or there's a plus and minus thing here. There's other tools where you can make it full page. You can save it, you can print it, all different. Here's share to Facebook, whatever, download, print. Reference URL is, I think, if you're going to link it to another source. This one here, this is not my Gustav Zimmerman, but it's interesting because this one died at Eloise Sanitarium in Detroit, or in not exactly in Detroit, but I'm not sure, close there, in 1911. And so this one was married. He was 53. He was a blacksmith, which I know my great-grandfather was a blacksmith as well. But this other thing about Eloise Sanitarium and that doesn't mean anything to me. This one here doesn't have, this has unknown listed for name of father and so forth. They don't have any parent information, probably because he was at the hospital and maybe alone and there was nobody there to supply that kind of information to them. The informant is right here, has some name. Maybe he's a staff person of the hospital. So, yeah, so there's some different information there about this particular one. This had tuberculosis of the lungs, which that was one of the things that Eloise was used for, was as a tuberculosis sanitarium. So there's one Gustav Zimmerman. If I go back, and I'm going to look at this one. Okay, here's another Gustav Zimmerman. This one is my guy. Had his address, he's in Detroit on Meldrum, 886 Meldrum. Gustav Zimmerman, he died in 1910. He had his birth date 1836. He was 73. He was a blacksmith also. This one again does not have his parents listed, unfortunately. But it says this is an abbreviation for Germany. That his father and mother were born in Germany, which is true. His informant, this is an abbreviation for William, W.M. Eagle, which was his son-in-law in Detroit. So apparently his son-in-law didn't know this information about him, unfortunately. Place of burial or removal, it says crematorium. And it does not say the cemetery name in this case. And this is why I had this mystery of why I couldn't find this branch of the family, because it wasn't listed where he was buried in this thing that I found. But then later I found that baby's, his cause of death was cancer of the liver. And this number 40 is that code number that if you looked it up would probably say cancer of the liver. It tells how long he was being treated by this doctor, for about 3 days there before he died. If there's anything else here. Yeah, so that's that Gustav Zimmerman, which was mine. And then the first one, we'll just see what we'll see in that kind of a document. Oops. Okay, this is another Detroit one. Lived on Elizabeth Street. This guy was only 51. He had some kind of meningitis, and the 61 is the code number for that disease. He was an elevator operator for this scale company, the Stimson Scale Company. Those are interesting facts always when you're doing your family history, to know what occupations were and where they worked. These are from Germany also. This one, his father was also named Gustav Zimmerman, and his mother was Minnie something, but they don't know what her last maiden name was. This informant was his wife, Augusta Zimmerman. And place of burial was Woodmere Cemetery in Detroit. So that's the kind of information that you can find on these death certificates. For babies, like I said, that might have been stillborn, under name usually it would just say stillborn baby and their last name, and the dates and those sorts of things. That have their parents' names listed over here, and the cemetery usually. So if you're doing genealogy on Detroit or Michigan relatives, don't not use this, because it's really, really valuable information. It will give you clues that you can jump off to search in other sources and find more information. Another thing I wanted to say about it is this Michiganology used to be called Seeking Michigan. Instead of Michiganology, it was seekingmichigan.org. And it was called that for like the first 10 years or so that it was around. And then last fall, they changed the name of it to Michiganology. redesigned the website and everything. So it works a little differently now, and they're adding more documents, more types of things to it. So it's a very good thing to check out, and make sure that you do. And if you have any questions about it, I will be back at the library. My name is Debbie, once we reopen. And I would be happy to answer your questions and help you try to use this and any other genealogy information that we have. And eventually we'll probably get back to the one-on-one sessions that we had. So, happy researching.